SABC News presentation.
And you're watching Interface here on SABC3. Good evening and a warm welcome to you. My name is Thembisa Magele. People living with disabilities bear the brunt of unemployment, a lack of facilities, and generally they struggle to get services. Now, according to the National Council for People with Disabilities, childcare centres across the country are not adequately supported, while some may even face closure. Tonight on Interface, we look at some of these challenges, and my guests are Lydia Pretorius, who is the Chief Director for Monitoring and Evaluation at the Department of Women, Children and People Living with Disabilities, and Terina Wenzel is from the National Council of People with Disabilities. A warm welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
There's been a significant rise, let's start with you, Lydia, a significant rise in the number of people that live with disabilities in the workplace. Is it a fair divide between the private and the public sector?
Thembisa, I think so. I think the issues here are that there's definitely an increase in the presence of people with disabilities in the workplace in terms of numbers. To what extent they are able to be productive, to what extent companies and governments are able to provide them with reasonable accommodation that makes them productive. That's becoming a big issue. So it's not just about the numbers, but also whether they are enabled to be productive or not. If you employ a blind worker and you do not provide them with the necessary tools to be productive, you know...
And doesn't that perpetuate that tick box mentality that we have in South Africa? You know, are you black, are you female, are you disabled? If you're all three yay, you know, then we get the most scores. But does it actually equate to productivity at the end of the day?
It's a big issue for us. We know of too many disabled people employed, earning a salary, highly frustrated because they feel that although they've been given a job, they've got an income, they are not able to contribute. They could have just as well been sitting at home. Simply because they were employed as a wheelchair user in a building that does not allow them access into the building, or they've been employed in a building where the area where they work directly have been made accessible, but they're unable to go to the other units where they're supposed to also engage in productive work.
I can understand those issues and challenges coming up in the private sector. Does government also face the same problems?
Yes, it remains a big issue. Public Works has a program they're rolling out in terms of making public buildings accessible. Unfortunately, the spending has been very poor on that program. We've recently, in terms of the reports we received, of the 99 million budgeted over the last 3 years, only about 45% of that has actually been spent. And it's
What's the problem? Why is it?
The reasons they give is that most of this are small jobs in terms of making things accessible, and that they're struggling to get contractors. But I think it's about dedicating a program, and it's about attitude. It's about wanting to make something work. I mean, even though the commitment has been there, we still see police stations going up that are inaccessible. There's a case in the northwest. We still see other buildings going up, and it's about attitude. If a person's attitude is right, they will ensure that they have the information that comply with legislation and that makes sense.
I want us to talk a little bit more about that, but I want to bring Terina Wenzel from the National Council of People Living with Disabilities into this conversation. Do you find that a lot of the government institutions and also the private sector have that tick box mentality still, or are you seeing a change when it comes to dealing with people living with disabilities?
Well, I must say we really do see a change. I'm happy to be able to honestly say that. We run an employment program nationally and in the provinces. We've got placement officers whose job it is to find jobs for people with disabilities and place them, and then play a support role for both the person with the disability as well as the employer. And we really find that attitudes are changing. There's still a problem, and there are people with a tick box mentality. Those are the ones that would send you an email or call you and say, we need so many people with disabilities, these must be the types of disabilities, and we need it by then. So then a little bit of job reservation comes into it, which I don't think is just ignorance, but which is a bit sad, because people can decide which jobs they want to apply for.
And here's the question though, the people living with disabilities, do they have the right qualifications in the majority? Do they have the right skills for the jobs that they're being sought for?
Look, there's a lot of people that are still struggling to get skilled, and because of the whole education thing, not everybody is as skilled as the job market would want to have. But we are sitting on our database with quite a number of people that are very well skilled and that are not getting employment, and it's mainly due to transport and infrastructure issues and some of the things which Lydia mentioned, the reasonable accommodation which is misunderstood or which is completely just not there. And then obviously also the matter of the fact that people have got misconceptions about certain types of disabilities. We often get people that says, we don't want somebody with this or with that disability, which is really discrimination.
Yeah.
And it's because people don't understand.
Lydia, why is this still a problem so far into our democracy?
Tembisa, I think it's people that don't want to confront their own awkwardness, their own fears and their stereotypes they grew up with in terms of disability. It's also people that are not willing to really, they talk diversity, but they're not willing to live diversity.
And I can almost, have a different conversation with somebody in the private sector who has that kind of attitude. But I'm very concerned by what you've said, that even government institutions, even government departments are still battling with this, when government itself is the one that is promulgating this law.
No, it remains a challenge. We've been working with the Department of Public Service and Administration around getting a reasonable accommodation policy in place. And what we're trying to get there is that there's a fixed budget line. That, in other words, if I am employed as a blind person, it's not at that point that the department has to say, did we budget for IT equipment for a person that is blind? No, we didn't budget, so he's going to have to wait a year.
Sure.
There should be a budget for reasonable accommodation, fixed, ready to use, to tap into, and where money can be moved in and out of as and when required. Because, as I said, it's about productivity. It's also about workplace safety. A person that's in a wheelchair or a person that is visually impaired and the building is not accommodating them in terms of accessibility, it becomes a safety issue also. So yeah, it's a challenge.
So the method of dealing with that now is the program that you say Public Works has. Is there anything else that's being done to try and expedite this?
We are. Cabinet is quite adamant at the moment that the elusive 2% has to be reached. We actually want to up the percentage. Yeah. The problem with targets is, and we had a recent case in Limpopo where a department advertised posts. They had, say, 15 disabled people applying. There were 4 posts that they have reserved for disabled people. And after they decided these 4 candidates get it, they sent the others home and said no. And they said, but there are other posts being advertised. And they said, no, but we've reached our 2%. We don't need to employ more. So that's a problem. And that's what I'm saying to you. It fundamentally comes back to attitude. Your willingness to accommodate, to see the contribution that person makes to the workplace and not just sitting around.
Well, that's the question we're going to be asking you. Should we continue with targets for people living with disabilities, particularly in government, or should we just have an open workplace where people just come and apply and it shouldn't matter, whether they are disabled or not? Give us your thoughts on our Facebook page. That is Interface on SABC3. Interface on SABC3, that's how you get in touch with us. By email, interfaceon3@sabc.co.za. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we continue with this discussion. Welcome back. You're watching Interface, and I'm chatting to Lydia Pretorius, who is the Chief Director for Monitoring and Evaluation at the Department of Women, Children and People with Disabilities. Not living with disabilities, with disabilities. I've been corrected here that your disability is not a disease that goes away or comes and goes. It is something that is there. So you don't need to say you live with it, you just have it. It's people with disabilities. So thank you, ladies, for correcting me on that. And Terina Wenzel is with the National Council of People with Disabilities. Now, let's just take a look at some of your Facebook messages, some powerful messages coming through, and some questions for you ladies, and scenarios that are being painted. Tsiriso Samuel Rangwanana says, a young blind graduate who went for an interview for a job, one of the worries of the interview panel was, who will guide you to the bathroom or to the toilet? This will need the services of a permanent person, they argued. She was denied that job opportunity because of that problem. Now, Natalie Johnson says blind and deaf women are being raped and don't report the rapes because as a blind person, they're classified as unreliable witnesses. And Nolbabalo Makubela says the Department of Education must look into training preschool educators for children with special needs, and there aren't any at the moment. We will have to ask you about that, Lydia, and we'll have to chat about that a little later. Ritabile Pufolo says, I had to take out my ankle due to an accident and put steel, so I cannot move my ankle. I've been to the traffic department. I cannot get an automatic license because I am not visibly disabled. I cannot drive a manual car because of my feet. No one seems to know what exactly I should be doing. They tell me that I have to get a manual license, but I can't drive a manual car. What do I do? So, ladies, these are some of the challenges that are being posed to you. Let's start with Tidiso's one of the employers that say, we can't hire you because we'll have to hire an extra person just to guide you to the loo.
Tembisa, that's where we came, what we earlier referred to as the reasonable accommodation issue. This is a graduate with skills that will require some personal assistance to be able to fulfill her duties. In terms of guiding her to the loo, blind people that have undergone independence training, once they've been orientated in the workplace, that's not an issue. The issue is documents that are sent to them in a format that they're not able to engage with. So they will either require software or, for example, if their job requires them driving around, they will require personal assistance. But the issue here becomes, what is the value that person brings into the workplace in terms of their skills vis-a-vis the extra investment that is being done? If I can give you an example, for example, a company that has a ICT guy that's quite clued up, the guy gets a better offer, wants to go, the company ups the offer to keep him there. Nobody then talks about the extra cost this person is bringing in terms
Suddenly
of...
money is available.
Suddenly money is available. It's just when it's a disability that the extra money becomes an issue. And that's what we are saying. The Employment Equity Act requires that we invest in disabled people in the workplace and that we invest in those reasonable accommodation measures. Let
me ask you, Terina, government does not force the private sector to hire people with disabilities. There are incentives there if you do. Should we be more tougher as a government in South Africa? Should we, give a little bit more of the stick and less of the carrot to try and make sure that we push through as many of the people that you talk about into the workplace?
Absolutely, yeah. I think government should be consistent. I wouldn't say that government should bring out the stick when it comes to people with disabilities, but when the Department of Labour are busy with their inspections and bring out their reports, and not just government, but even in the private sector, where obviously government and Department of Labour also plays a role, it's very important that there must be consistency. When other targets are audited, then people with disabilities must be treated the same. And we very often see reports where it's reported on women and people of color, but not of people with disabilities. Obviously, as a NGO sector and from civil society, we're very strong on the fact that people with disabilities have got abilities like anybody else, and we strongly believe in the abilities of people with disabilities. And what we push, if we do placements, is the abilities and not the legislation. But we're just asking for fairness and equality.
I could maybe just add that with the Employment Equity Amendment Bill that's currently in Parliament, the bill attempts to actually try and put more of the stick and not just the carrot. The private sector, in terms of designated employers, are required to set targets for themselves and to achieve those targets. There were 6 or 7 companies that did achieve their targets in the past year in terms of the Commission of Employment Equity report. But there's not really any consequences if you don't achieve your targets.
But isn't it a case of the government not being able to enforce any consequences because you don't have your house in order to begin with?
Well, the government departments that don't comply should also face the same consequences. So the amendment bill seeks to actually tighten up the consequences aspect. For example, it's always been mooted that a company that doesn't comply should not be given government tenders. In terms of equity targets. It was one of the sort of mechanisms that is being looked at. Yeah. In terms of government, if you don't meet your targets, your consequences should be that in terms of your performance system, that head of department, that director general should simply be penalized. The HR
I thought
component.
That was something that would be happening already. I'm surprised that it's not.
It's applied selectively. Where there's attitude, where there's commitment, sure, it's applied. Where there's not, it's not. So part of our work with the Department of Public Service has been on how do we tighten the screws. One of the issues we're also looking at is how do we change the onus of proving why you weren't employed if you are disabled, from the disabled job seeker having to prove that there was discrimination, to the employer having to explain why the disabled job seekers and applicants could not be considered.
Are you putting any kind of pressure on the government to get its house in order in this regard? Because I'm thoroughly shocked that this is still an issue within government.
We absolutely do put pressure. One of the things which we're currently busy with is the Department of Labour used to, for quite a while, subsidize what they call a labour placement subsidy for some NGOs to assist government in reaching these targets, and they've just stopped that 6 months ago. It wasn't announced, it was just stopped, and the NGOs, in other words, have got a capacity gap there because of that. So that is one of the areas where NGOs are now working together to put pressure. But also on the other side, there are departments who are doing quite well. For example, the Department of Justice. And what we're trying to do is to showcase what is happening in one department and to prove that it can work.
It can
because
be done.
We do really get a lot of people still saying that it's a matter of ignorance because of they think there's costs associated with, and like the first question that you asked, Lydia, I mean, there's very, very, very few blind people that has to have a permanent assistant in the workplace.
And like Lydia said, if you guide them around for the first week, for example, you can even ask a colleague to do that.
It depends on
they get to know
what type of a job it is.
Yes.
So your reasonable accommodation is not linked to your disability. It's linked to the job requirements and as how that relates to your disability. So, and I think that's part of the challenge is people think if I'm going to employ a blind person, I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, tick the boxes. And we keep saying to them, it's not.
Like
it's the
just enable them to do the job that you've hired them to do as best as they
can. It's like
can.
employing a deaf person. You don't have to employ a sign language interpreter alongside the deaf person. It really depends on the job.
All right. We continue with this discussion after this, and we tackle some of your Facebook messages. Keep them coming. Interface on SABC3. Stay with us. Former President Nelson Mandela is quoted as saying, disabled children are equally entitled to an exciting and brilliant future. Now, if you look at the graphic that I'm going to ask that we put up, some of the centers that deal with children, particularly in rural areas, don't get the support, particularly from government, to be able to function well. And we all agree when we stand on these podiums that children do indeed deserve that bright future. Why is it, Lydia, that we have so many of these centers not supported by government?
I think the first issue is we must ask why they are there. If in a village children go to a ECD, Early Childhood Development Program, and disabled children are not allowed to go there or are not welcomed there, that's when you start having centers that cater for disabled children only. Because parents are sitting with the children, they are unable to engage in economic activity because they've got to look after the child. In addition to that, the child is not always safe at home. If they're locked in home, they don't get out. So the parents come together, and as a desperate attempt to be able to release some of them to economic activity, they start these care centers. So the first issue that we need to ask ourselves is, why do we need centers only for disabled children, and why are they not accommodated in the mainstream centers?
Is it a good idea to have those centers?
Well, yes and no, because obviously we fight for mainstreaming and for making sure that children with disabilities are included in other centres. But the reality is that it doesn't happen. So
but
yes,
will they get the best care, though, if they are in those mainstream centres?
not at this stage in South Africa. And again, we can't generalise, because in some centres, depending on the attitude of the people there and who it is, maybe they'll go the extra mile and learn. But even in the centres for children with disabilities, the disabilities of the children are so diverse that you can not really expect one or two people to have all the knowledge about all the disabilities. So at this stage, yes, those centres fulfill a fantastic role, and I really salute the mothers that start them, because it's under difficult circumstances.
And that takes us back to Nolbabalo Maqubela's Facebook message, where she says the Department of Education, and you're saying it's the Department of Social Development that must look into this, training preschool educators for children with special needs.
It is happening, not on the scale we would like to see, and not in terms of to the extent that we would like to see. The training is the secret in getting children to be accepted in mainstream centres. It's training those educators, and if you train an early childhood development educator to cater for children with special needs, it improves their ability in general to stimulate and assist all children in the centre. So it is happening. There are curricula, not to the extent that we want to see. There are plans in place, but we have also, for example, been engaging some of the private sector companies that have invested in huge amounts in early childhood development educator training, that have not brought in an inclusive education component. Because it's not only government that does training. There's a huge amount of NGO training as well as private sector training. And it's for us about ensuring that where money goes in into ECD training, that we ensure that those educators are equipped to be able to accommodate all children and not only some children. You know, if you do it in a mainstreaming way, in an inclusive way, you will have in each centre maybe 2 or 3 disabled children amongst all the other children.
Is there a more coordinated approach to this kind of training that we should be applying, particularly in dealing with the funds that are coming from the private sector? Because we've got a lot of companies that are willing to put money for these programs, but it seems very haphazard.
Yeah, we feel actually at this stage the training, most of the training that's initiated from government sides, sorry Lydia, is really completely inappropriate for equipping the caregivers and the educators for these children with disabilities. We go into these little centres, you see a whole lot of certificates hanging on the wall of all the training that they've attended, and somebody was paid for it, and the kids are sitting there and there's absolutely no skill to deal with the children.
Lydia, how do you respond to that? Because that's a serious allegation.
I agree. No, I agree.
Yeah.
What has happened is that the Department of Performance Monitoring and Evaluation recently concluded a study, a diagnostic review of early childhood development in South Africa, broadly. And we worked with them to ensure that that study is inclusive of children with disabilities. They are currently finalizing what they call an ECD plan out of that diagnostic, which will bring on board all departments, all NGOs, all private sector. And one of the very important aspects of that is coordination of training, ensuring that the modules are practical, are really assisting. But I think the other part that's very important here is that as soon as a child enters an ECD program, a child with a disability in particular, that already at that point, one needs to start saying, where's this child going to school? Because early childhood development prepares a child for school. And what happens with children with disabilities is that it tends to become just a place where they are cared for. And there's no planning from how do they graduate from the ECD centre into school. So that when the child reaches the age of 7, people start asking around, and the mother is forced to beg and plead and threaten to actually get this child into school.
We're running out of time, but this brings us to this this point that this criticism against your department in particular. All the time it comes up that there seems to be very little bite to the department in trying to make sure that these programs are pushed through, in trying to make sure that people with disabilities, women, children are well taken care of. What are you doing to make sure that you have more of a voice, more of an impact in South Africa?
I think it's about understanding the mandate of the department in terms of how we go about. And yes, it's early days. We've taken a long time to get ourselves established, to get ourselves being just to be a department. I think a lot of it has been about advocacy work with departments, trying to find out exactly where are the gaps. Because a lot of people are doing a lot of things, but if they're not working in tandem, in the gaps, we don't get the outcomes. Okay. We also need to understand that we work within an outcomes approach in government. So it's not about us taking coordination responsibilities over from a department that has already been allocated that. It's about how do we assist them through analysis, through monitoring, and saying, you need to work harder here. We need to bring the stakeholder on board to get better results.
All right, we have to leave it there, but we will watch and see how far you get with that, and all the best with the work that you're doing as well. Thank you so much to my guests for joining us tonight. And remember that you can continue the conversation on Facebook, Interface on SABC3. And also, if you want to drop us a line on email, you can do that, interfaceon3@sabc.co.za. Catch us again next time. From me, Thembisa Magele, and the team. Good night.